My name is Victoria Nakamura. I'm 29 and I'm a data analyst for a healthcare technology company in Seattle, Washington, which means I've spent the last 6 years working directly with the kind of administrative systems that quietly log far more detail than most people ever realize, including, as it turns out, exactly which vehicles enter and exit a hospital parking structure and when. Accused by my own cousin of never once driving our grandfather to his dialysis appointments during the hardest year of his kidney disease, I sat in a family meeting 2 months ago, watching the clinic's billing coordinator pull up parking validation records that told a very different story than the one my cousin had been repeating for months. I was literally the only one driving him 3 times a week, my cousin, Amber, had said, arms crossed, at a family dinner I wasn't present for, but heard about secondhand from my mother. Victoria showed up maybe twice, if that. If you're watching this, comment where you're from and what time it is right now for you, and hit subscribe, because you need to see how this unfolds. This is a long one, so settle in. Let me take you back to where this actually started. My grandfather, Kenji Nakamura, was born in 1948 in a small fishing town outside Fukuoka, Japan, the second of 5 children in a family that made its living, for generations, off the sea. He immigrated to the United States in 1971 at 23, with almost no English and 2 suitcases, following an older cousin who'd already settled in Seattle and written home about work available at the shipping yards. My grandfather never worked the yards himself, as it turned out. Within his first year in the country, he found work repairing radios and, later, televisions at a small electronics shop in the International District, a trade he'd learned informally from an uncle back in Japan who'd tinkered with ham radios his whole life. He met my grandmother, Sachiko, in 1974 at a community center dance neither of them had originally planned to attend. He'd gone because a co-worker dragged him along. She'd gone because her roommate insisted, and by his own account retold in nearly every family gathering for decades, he spent the first 20 minutes of that dance too nervous to approach her, watching her from across the room while pretending to be interested in the refreshment table. They married 18 months later and eventually opened their own shop, Nakamura Electronics Repair, which my grandfather ran for 41 years until arthritis in his hands finally made the fine motor work of circuit repair too difficult to continue reliably. I was closer to my grandfather growing up than most of my cousins, partly because my own parents divorced when I was 7 and my mother, his daughter, moved back into the family's orbit more heavily during those years, meaning I spent an enormous amount of time at my grandparents' house after school while my mother worked. I remember sitting on an overturned crate in the corner of his repair shop for hours at a time, watching him work with a magnifying loupe strapped to his head, handing him small screwdrivers when he asked for them, listening to him hum old Japanese folk songs under his breath while he worked, songs I never learned the names of, but could still recognize the melodies of decades later. My grandmother passed away in 2019, 5 years before any of the events in this story, and my grandfather, in the years since, had settled into a quieter, more solitary rhythm of life, filling his days with woodworking projects in his garage and weekly calls with his surviving siblings back in Japan. Still fluent enough in Japanese despite 50 years in America that he switched between languages mid-sentence without seeming to notice he was doing it. His kidney disease diagnosis came 2 years ago, following months of fatigue and swelling in his legs that he'd initially dismissed as simply getting old, a phrase he used dismissively about nearly every health concern until a routine checkup revealed kidney function low enough that his doctor insisted on an immediate nephrology referral. The diagnosis, end-stage renal disease requiring regular dialysis, arrived with the kind of finality that reorganizes an entire family's rhythm around a medical schedule none of us had any prior experience navigating. My cousin Amber, the daughter of my my mother's sister, my Aunt Diane, lived the closest to my grandfather geographically, about 15 minutes from his house. And she immediately, without anyone formally asking her to, took charge of organizing his care. Logistics once the diagnosis came in. I want to be fair to her from the outset of this story. Taking on that coordinating role wasn't a small thing, and somebody needed to do it, and Amber did it with genuine competence in terms of the actual scheduling logistics, at least initially. She set up a family group chat titled, somewhat grandly, Grandpa's Care Team, and within it established a rotating schedule for who would handle transportation to his 3 weekly dialysis sessions, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday mornings, each requiring roughly 4 hours at the clinic given the length of a standard dialysis treatment plus check-in and recovery time afterward. I volunteered for the Tuesday and Thursday slots almost immediately, for reasons that had more to do with practical logistics than any particular nobility on my part, and I think it's important to be honest about that rather than presenting myself as more selfless than I actually was. I work as a data analyst, and about 18 months before my grandfather's diagnosis, my company had shifted to a fully remote arrangement for most of the analytics team, meaning my weekday mornings were, in practice, considerably more flexible than almost anyone else's in the extended family, most of whom work traditional in-office schedules with far less room to disappear for 4 hours on a Tuesday without using vacation time. Amber, working as an assistant manager at a home goods retail chain, had weekends more reliably free than weekdays, which made the Saturday slot the natural fit for her schedule, and that's largely how the rotation settled. Not through any explicit negotiation or discussion between us directly, but through the group chat's general logistics, sorting themselves along the lines of whoever had the most natural availability for each specific day. I lived about 40 minutes further from my grandfather's house than Amber did, a detail that would later become strangely relevant to the confrontation that eventually unfolded, since it fed into an assumption, apparently widely held among the extended family, that geographic proximity naturally translated to greater involvement. I never corrected that assumption directly, mostly because I didn't think about it much at the time. I simply started driving out twice a week, picking my grandfather up around 7 in the morning to make his 8 o'clock check-in time, and settling into what would become, over the following 11 months, one of the more significant routines of my adult life. I want to spend real time describing what those Tuesday and Thursday mornings actually looked like, because I think the confrontation that eventually happened and the record-based correction that resolved it only matters if you understand the actual texture of what was being erased. The drive from my grandfather's house to the clinic took about 30 minutes, and in the early months, he was almost always talkative during that stretch, a habit I came to treasure once I understood how much rarer it would become as the disease progressed and the treatments themselves grew more taxing on his body. He told me stories I'd never heard in quite that level of detail before, despite having grown up practically underfoot in his repair shop. Stories about his own father's fishing boat, lost in a typhoon in 1962 when my grandfather was only 14, a loss that had pushed the family toward considering emigration in the first place, since the fishing income that had sustained them for generations simply wasn't reliable anymore without that specific boat and the specific knowledge his father had. Cared about the local waters. He told me about his first winter in Seattle, 1971 into 1972, sharing a single-room apartment with 3 other recent immigrants, none of whom spoke much English between them, cooking meals on a single hot plate and pooling money for rent that still, some months, came up short. He told me about meeting my grandmother, a story I'd heard the broad strokes of dozens of times at family gatherings, but never in the granular detail he offered during those car rides. The specific song playing when he finally worked up the nerve to ask her to dance, a detail he remembered with startling clarity 50 years later, though he could no longer remember, some days, what he'd eaten for breakfast that same morning. The clinic itself was a squat, unremarkable building about 30 minutes from his house, the kind of medical facility that exists in a strange administrative purgatory of fluorescent lighting and vinyl recliners, industrial and clinical in a way that never quite adjusts to feeling comfortable no matter how many times you visit it. I'd walk him in, help him check in at the front desk, and then settle into the waiting area for the 4-hour duration of his treatment, since the treatment room itself only accommodated patients and staff, not family members waiting the full session out. Some mornings, I brought my laptop and worked quietly in the corner of the waiting area, a small mercy of my remote job that let me combine caregiving with genuine productivity rather than losing 4 hours entirely, twice a week, every week, for nearly a year. Other mornings, particularly in the earlier months before I'd fully adjusted my own routine around the schedule, I simply sat with a book I rarely made meaningful progress through, glancing periodically through the glass partition that separated the waiting area from the treatment bay, watching my grandfather doze in his recliner, tubes running from his arm to a machine, quietly doing the work his own kidneys could no longer manage. I remember distinctly the specific vending machine in that waiting room, which offered exactly 3 snack options that never seemed to change over the entire 11 months I sat there. A particular brand of pretzels, a granola bar I never once saw anyone actually purchase, and a chocolate chip cookie that, despite its unremarkable vending machine origins, became something close to a ritual for me. One purchased almost every Tuesday and Thursday morning around the 90-minute mark of each session, when my own attention typically started to wander and I needed a small excuse to get up and move. I also remember the specific staff who became familiar faces over those months. A dialysis technician named Grace, who always greeted my grandfather by name, and within a few months greeted me the same way, remembering small details about our lives with the kind of attentiveness that made an otherwise sterile clinical environment feel marginally more human. There was a receptionist, an older woman named Patricia, who kept a small dish of individually wrapped mints at the front desk and always slipped me one on my way in. A tiny, consistent kindness that somehow became one of the details I associate most strongly with that entire period of my life. About 7 months into the routine, on a Thursday morning, I remember with unusual clarity, given how routine most of these mornings had become by that point, my grandfather's blood pressure dropped unexpectedly partway through his treatment. A complication the nursing staff explained afterward wasn't uncommon in dialysis patients, but which, in the moment, looked and felt considerably more alarming than any clinical explanation could fully soften. I was sitting in my usual corner of the waiting area, laptop open, when I noticed through the glass partition a sudden flurry of movement around my grandfather's treatment chair. 2 nurses converging quickly, adjusting something on the machine, one of them speaking into a radio clip to her scrubs. I stood immediately, moving toward the partition, though I knew, rationally, there was nothing useful I could actually do from the waiting area, some instinct simply pulling me physically closer regardless. A nurse came out a few minutes later, calm but clearly moving with purpose, to explain that his blood pressure had dropped during the fluid removal process, a recognized risk of the treatment itself, and that they were adjusting his fluid rate and monitoring him closely, and that he'd likely be fine within the hour, but that I should be prepared for the possibility they'd want to keep him slightly longer than usual for observation. I remember standing just outside the treatment bay for the better part of 20 minutes after that, genuinely frightened in a way I hadn't processed until much later that evening. Once I was home alone and the adrenaline of the moment had fully worn off. Amber wasn't there that day, obviously, since it was a Thursday and her slot was Saturdays, and I remember feeling, in that specific moment of fear, an unexpected clarity about why the actual physical presence during these appointments mattered in a way that scheduling coordination from a distance simply couldn't replicate. Coordination is genuinely valuable. It does not, however, catch a falling blood pressure reading in real time, or stand outside a treatment bay feeling helpless and present simultaneously, in the specific way that only being physically there requires of you. My grandfather did recover within the hour, as the nurse had predicted, and by the time I drove him home that afternoon, he was joking in his characteristically understated way that he'd earned his keep by giving the staff something interesting to do that morning. I laughed along with him in the car, relieved beyond what I probably let on, and it's a small exchange that I've held on to since as one of the more meaningful moments of that entire 11-month stretch, precisely because it happened in a waiting room and a treatment bay that nobody else in the family witnessed, or, I'd later realize, ever fully understood the emotional weight of. Throughout these 11 months, the family group chat that Amber had established early on remained active, though its content, I noticed gradually, had begun to skew heavily toward her own updates rather than a balanced accounting of the actual rotation as a whole. She'd post, most Saturdays, some version of another long day at dialysis with Grandpa alongside a photo of the 2 of them, often taken in the parking lot before or after his appointment, brief but consistent enough that anyone scrolling through the chat's history would come away with the strong impression that Amber was the primary, most consistent presence in my grandfather's ongoing care. I didn't post similar updates on my own Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and I want to be honest about why. Because I think the reasoning matters to understanding how this situation was allowed to develop the way it did. Part of it was simple personality, I've never been especially inclined to narrate my own daily activities for an audience, even a small family one. A trait that had nothing specifically to do with my grandfather's care and everything to do with the general discomfort I've always felt about performing effort for external validation. Part of it, too, was a genuine belief that showing up consistently didn't need public acknowledgement to be worthwhile, that the actual value of driving him to his appointments existed independently of whether anyone else in the extended family was tracking it. In retrospect, I think this was a reasonable personal philosophy that nonetheless created exactly the conditions for the confrontation that eventually happened. Amber's consistent, visible narration of her own involvement, paired with my consistent silence about mine, meant that the family's collective understanding of who does what for our grandfather's care gradually drifted quite far from what was actually happening on the ground twice a week, in a waiting room 40 minutes from where most of the extended family actually lived their daily lives. My mother, who wasn't part of the rotation herself due to her own demanding work schedule, mentioned to me on more than one occasion during those months that she'd seen Amber's group chat updates and assumed, based on their frequency and detail, that Amber really was handling the bulk of the driving. I corrected this assumption gently each time, mentioning that I had the Tuesday and Thursday slots, but I don't think my low-key corrections ever fully overrode the more vivid, visual impression created by Amber's regular photo updates. There's something about a consistent stream of small, visible evidence, even something as simple as a parking lot photo, that tends to outweigh occasional, quieter verbal corrections in how people's memories and impressions actually settle over time. The specific claim that eventually led to real confrontation happened at a family dinner hosted at my Aunt Diane's house, Amber's mother, a gathering I wasn't present for due to a work commitment that particular evening, which meant I only learned about what was said secondhand, through my own mother, who called me the following morning still visibly troubled by what she'd heard. According to my mother's account, the conversation arose naturally enough, prompted by another relative asking Amber how our grandfather was holding up given how demanding his treatment schedule had become. Amber, apparently without any particular malice in her tone, according to my mother, responded with an account of the past several months that positioned herself as essentially the sole family member managing his transportation. I was literally the only one driving him 3 times a week, Amber reportedly said, according to my mother's retelling. Victoria showed up maybe twice, if that. She's always been too busy with her job to actually help out with stuff like this. My mother told me she'd wanted to correct this in the moment, but hadn't felt equipped to do so with confidence, since she didn't have the exact appointment counts memorized herself and didn't want to contradict Amber directly without concrete information to back up the correction. She mentioned it to me the next day, mostly out of a sense that I deserved to know what was being said, rather than out of any expectation that I'd necessarily do anything about it. I felt, hearing this secondhand account, a specific combination of frustration and a kind of tired resignation that I think anyone who's ever had their contribution to something quietly erased by someone else's louder narrative will probably recognize. It wasn't that I needed public recognition for driving my grandfather to dialysis. I would have continued doing it regardless of whether anyone in the extended family ever acknowledged it accurately. What stung was the specific, confident inaccuracy of the claim, the casual dismissal of nearly a year of consistent effort during one of the more genuinely difficult periods of his illness, delivered with enough certainty that nobody at that dinner apparently thought to question it. I didn't immediately decide to confront Amber directly about it. I've never been someone who enjoys direct confrontation, and my initial instinct, consistent with how I'd handled the entire situation up to that point, was simply to let it go and continue showing up on my Tuesday and Thursday mornings regardless of what anyone else believed about my involvement. I think if the family meeting 2 months later hadn't happened the way it did, I might well have continued that pattern indefinitely, quietly absorbing an inaccurate narrative rather than ever directly correcting it. The meeting that eventually surfaced the truth wasn't organized with any intention of settling this particular dispute. It was called because my grandfather's nephrologist had recommended a change to his treatment protocol, transitioning him to a schedule requiring fewer weekly sessions, given some improvement in his overall kidney function markers, and the family wanted to gather together with his medical team to understand exactly what the new schedule would look like going forward. The meeting was held partly at the clinic itself, in a small conference room adjacent to the treatment area. with my grandfather's nephrologist present alongside a clinic administrator handling some unrelated insurance authorization questions that had come up regarding his ongoing coverage. The administrator, a woman named Denise who handled billing and administrative coordination for the clinic, wasn't there for any reason connected to the family dispute simmering beneath the surface of the gathering. She was simply present to walk through some paperwork related to my grandfather's updated treatment authorization. Partway through the meeting, during a natural lull while the nephrologist reviewed some lab results with my grandfather directly, my Aunt Diane made an offhand comment, more nostalgic than pointed, about how much the whole family had pulled together over the past year to manage his transportation needs. My grandfather, in response, mentioned with genuine warmth how much he'd appreciated everyone who drove him all those Tuesdays and Thursdays, a comment that prompted my aunt to ask, half joking and entirely without any real intention of settling a dispute, whether clinics like this one kept any kind of formal record of who actually brought patients in for their appointments. Denise, entirely unaware of the tension quietly underlying this seemingly casual question, mentioned that the clinic's parking structure, which validated patient parking as part of the overall billing and administrative process, actually did maintain records tied to each patient's visit, information that existed primarily for insurance and facility management purposes, but which could, in principle, show which vehicles had been validated for a given patient's appointments. Actually, Denise said, opening her laptop with the simple, unhurried helpfulness of someone offering a mildly interesting bit of administrative trivia rather than settling a family conflict, I can pull up the validation history for Kenji's visits over the past year, if that's useful at all for coordinating his continued care going forward, now that the schedule's changing. She scrolled through the system for a moment, and then, without any dramatic intention behind the comment whatsoever, said, "Looks like most of the Tuesday and Thursday morning visits were validated under a parking ticket linked to a vehicle registered to Victoria Nakamura. There's a decent number under an Amber Tanaka too, mostly clustered on Saturdays, from what I can see here." Amber, sitting across the small conference table from me, went visibly still. "That doesn't sound right," she said, her voice carrying an edge of genuine surprise rather than performed indignation. "I was the one doing most of the driving." Denise, still entirely unaware she'd stumbled into anything beyond a routine administrative question, glanced at her screen again, scrolling briefly. "The system shows 80-some visits validated under Victoria's plate over the past 11 months, and around a dozen under Amber's. I'm just reading what's logged here. I don't have any other context beyond what the system shows." The room went quiet in the specific way a meeting goes quiet when a confidently repeated claim suddenly meets an inconvenient administrative record that nobody in the room, including Denise herself, had expected to exist or matter in this particular way. Amber's face shifted, in the span of a few seconds, from composed confidence to visible, flustered uncertainty. "I did a lot of the actual coordinating," Amber said, her voice tightening noticeably. "Scheduling the whole rotation, communicating with everyone in the group chat, keeping the whole thing organized." "You did," I said, keeping my voice calm and even, genuinely not wanting to diminish what she had actually contributed, even in a moment that could easily have tipped towards something more openly confrontational. "I never said you didn't help organize things, Amber. I just also drove Grandpa to dialysis 80-some times over the past year. And I didn't appreciate hearing secondhand that I showed up maybe twice at a dinner I wasn't even present at to correct myself." My grandfather, who had been listening to this exchange with the quiet attentiveness he brought to most family conversations, spoke up gently, but with unmistakable clarity. "Victoria has been with me nearly every Tuesday and Thursday morning for the better part of a year," he said. "I remember exactly who was sitting in that waiting room with me, week after week, month after month. I don't forget things like that, whatever else this illness has taken from my memory lately." Amber's composure cracked more fully then, a genuine flash of embarrassment crossing her face that she didn't attempt to hide. "I think I got so focused on how exhausting the coordinating felt," she said, quieter now, "that I let myself believe I was doing more of everything, not just the scheduling part. I didn't mean to make it sound like you weren't there at all, Victoria. I don't think I even fully realized I was saying that until just now, hearing it said back to me." "I understand feeling like the coordinating is exhausting," I said. "It probably is, genuinely. I just don't think it needed to come at the cost of erasing what I was actually doing every single week, especially not in front of the rest of the family, at a dinner where I wasn't even there to speak for myself. The meeting continued, after that exchange, with a noticeably more collaborative tone, refocused appropriately on the practical matter of my grandfather's updated treatment schedule rather than the family tension that had briefly surfaced. Denise, still entirely unaware of the significance of what she'd casually revealed, moved forward with the insurance authorization paperwork she'd originally come to discuss, and the remainder of the meeting proceeded smoothly. Afterward, in the parking lot, Amber approached me privately, her earlier defensiveness fully gone, replaced by something more genuinely reflective. "I owe you an actual apology," she said, "not just for what got said tonight, but for the dinner too. Once I heard how that landed, I think organizing the rotation schedule made me feel like I was the one primarily responsible for his care, even on the days I wasn't actually the one driving him. I let that feeling turn into a story I told other people, without really checking whether the story matched what was actually happening. I told her I appreciated the apology, and that I understood, to some degree, how easy it might be to conflate the mental load of coordination with the physical reality of showing up, especially when guilt about not being able to do more yourself gets mixed into the equation. Amber, over the following weeks, called me on 2 separate occasions to continue that conversation more fully, admitting on the second call something I found more moving than I'd expected to. "I think I needed to believe I was doing enough," she told me, her voice quieter than I was used to hearing from her. "My work schedule genuinely doesn't allow for weekday flexibility the way yours does, and I think some part of me felt guilty about that, felt like I should have been able to do more of the actual driving." Instead of sitting with that guilt honestly, I think I convinced myself the coordinating work I was doing was equivalent to the physical presence I wished I could provide, but genuinely couldn't manage given my schedule. I stopped being honest with myself about what doing enough actually looked like, and I let that dishonesty leak into how I talked about you to other people, which wasn't fair to you at all. I found that admission genuinely moving, more than I'd expected to going into that conversation, because I think it names something that extends well beyond just our specific situation, a fairly common trap, I suspect, where the effort you wish you were making gets quietly substituted in your own internal accounting for the effort you're actually making, particularly when guilt is already present and looking for some way to resolve itself. I want to return, before closing this out, to the actual substance of those 86 drives, because I think it's easy in the retelling of a confrontation and its resolution to lose sight of what was actually being fought over in the first place. This wasn't really about winning an argument or being formally credited with a specific number of parking validations. It was about the accumulated weight of an entire year spent showing up for someone I loved during objectively one of the harder chapters of his long life, in a way that had genuinely mattered to both of us regardless of whether anyone else in the family ever accurately understood it. I think about the specific mornings that blur together now in memory. The routine of the 7 a.m. pickup, the 30-minute drive with the radio playing softly in the background, my grandfather's stories about his childhood in Japan gradually growing less frequent as the months wore on and the treatments themselves became more physically taxing on him, replaced by longer stretches of comfortable, unforced silence that I came to value just as much as the earlier conversations had, in their own quieter way. I also think honestly about my own professional relationship to systems like the one Denise pulled up that afternoon, because there was something genuinely strange about experiencing, from the family side for once, the exact kind of administrative data logging I spend my actual working life thinking about from a much more abstract, technical distance. In my job, parking validation systems, appointment histories, and billing records are simply data structures I help design and maintain. Categories of information that exist to serve institutional purposes like insurance reconciliation and facility management. Sitting in that conference room and watching Denise pull up my own grandfather's parking validation history felt oddly personal in a way my professional relationship to similar systems never quite manages to. A reminder that the systems I build and maintain for a living are the same systems quietly, almost incidentally, tracking the actual granular texture of people's real lives, including, in this particular case, my own. Our family's approach to my grandfather's ongoing care rotation has become considerably more transparent in the months since that meeting, a shift that emerged organically rather than through any explicit, formal decision. We now keep a shared calendar, visible to the entire extended family, logging who's actually driving him to each appointment under the new, reduced schedule, not out of any lingering suspicion toward one another, but simply because I think we all recognized through this specific situation how easily a family's collective understanding of who does what can drift quite far from what's actually happening on the ground if nobody's tracking it with any real precision. My grandfather's treatment schedule has since stabilized considerably under the new protocol his nephrologist recommended, requiring only 2 sessions a week rather than 3, and I still handle the Tuesday driving most weeks, though the frequency and intensity of the whole arrangement has eased in ways that make the entire routine feel considerably less consuming than it did during that first demanding year. He mentioned to me recently, in one of our now shorter drives to his reduced appointment schedule, how much he'd valued having consistent company during what had been, for him, one of the more genuinely frightening periods of his long life, a comment that meant more to me, honestly, than any correction of Amber's earlier claim ever managed to on its own. Amber and I have settled into a considerably more honest working relationship regarding our grandfather's care since that meeting, one where we actually check in with each other directly about who's handling which piece of his ongoing needs, rather than allowing assumptions to quietly calcify into whatever narrative happens to get repeated most confidently at the next family gathering. I don't think either of us fully anticipated, going into that meeting 2 months ago, that a routine insurance authorization conversation would end up surfacing something that had been quietly straining our relationship for the better part of a year. But I'm genuinely grateful, in retrospect, that it did, because I think both of us are better, more honest family members to each other now than we were before that unexpected administrative correction forced an overdue reckoning between us. Here's what I actually learned, sitting in that conference room and watching a clinic's routine parking validation system do more to correct the record than months of my own quiet frustration ever managed to accomplish on its own. Showing up consistently doesn't always look impressive from the outside if the person coordinating everything else happens to be the one narrating the family's shared story. People can tell a story about your absence as confidently and as often as they like. They can't argue with 86 parking validations tied unmistakably to your own license plate, logged across 11 consecutive months by a system that had no stake whatsoever in which version of the family narrative eventually prevailed. If this hit close to home, tell me in the comments about a time your own quiet caregiving got overshadowed by someone else's louder, more visible coordinating role. Subscribe if you want to see how these stories keep unfolding. Share this with someone in your own life who's ever shown up consistently for another person without needing anyone else to notice or acknowledge it, and I'll see you in the next one.